episode 8 of the Philosophical Rambler podcast. Today I'm joined by Mason Phillips and Sam Talon, who is our head of recruitment at Philosophical Rambler. Today we're going to be talking about the philosophical ethos of Appalachia in the United States and what it really means to be Appalachian and what that people group has to contribute culturally to the dialogue. So glad to have you guys on the podcast today. And yeah, just to get right off to it, Sam, you and I have talked a great deal about Appalachia and basically its history. We share a lot of the same lineage as far as our culture goes. Um, just to get right off the bat, what do you think is one of the greatest contributions that Appalachia has made?
The Appalachian spirit is really the American spirit in many ways. Just from my own, like if we can tell, well, we can tell our listeners kind of what is Appalachia if they're unfamiliar. Appalachia is uh, the mountainous region of the eastern part of the United States. It begins in New York and it trickles all the way down into northern Alabama, northern Mississippi. But so that's the mountain range. It's a large Appalachian mountain range, is what it is, with smaller subsidiary mountain ranges within that, like the Smoky Mountains, the Adirondacks, and stuff like that. But when we talk about Appalachia, we're not really just talking about a mountain range. We're talking about a whole culture and ethos, and which would incorporate um, you know, ethnicity, ethnic history, music, language, dialect, and a whole host of religious beliefs and political ideologies as well. And that's really centered in what we would call the central part of Appalachia, which would be your western Pennsylvania, and then into West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, southwest Virginia, western North Carolina, East Tennessee. And while I said the Appalachian spirit is very much the American spirit, is that what Appalachia has to contribute is, when we think of America, we think of, rugged individualism. We think of, we don't like tyrants in America. Um, we think of fighters. We think of freedom lovers, right? We think of liberty. Um, Very much so. All of those, and we also think of the exploratory spirit, the pioneer spirit. I mean, the American people conquered an entire, continent essentially, right? Over the course of a couple hundred years, and it really was the people of that same that had their roots in Appalachia. The people who settled Appalachia were the same people who went and, fought at the Alamo, or went to the wild, were involved in the Wild West, or went up into Oregon during the Gold Rush. It was the same stock of people with the same values, and and there's also the same people who settled, the Midwest as well. And
Mhm.
they really is the bedrock of what we think of as American rural culture and the whole ethos that's packed into that. I mean, country music is a great example as well. I mean, that comes straight from
Yeah, the
Appalachia.
heartland.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and very much
Yeah.
people.
Mason, if you want to contribute to that as well.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting. You're bringing up the point about the individuals and how they contribute to that identity, which is very true. You got the Scotch Irish people coming over, the Ulster Protestants, 90% of the European immigrants that came over were from that area. But then also, you get this identity that's formed by like the geography of the region as well. It's not just the pioneer spirit that's coming over. Once they're settling, it's not an easy job up in the mountains. They're secluded. You don't get your traditional city building that you get in the Midwest or the Northeast. The mountains themselves kind of protect against that, so that makes it tough on those individuals, and kind of contributes to that familial and maybe the backward stereotype that a lot of people from Appalachia get. But I think that's very interesting that so much of their culture has just been driven by the geographical features that they've been forced to live with as well.
I think that has a big influence. Obviously, the environment in which people live, regardless of their ethnicity or what their heritage or culture may be, what really shapes a people is what's around them, their environment. If you look at Midwesterners, their environment shapes a lot of how they feel. As all of us are from the Midwest, we can attest to that in the fact that, we don't have that many hills. We have a very flat land, generally speaking, And I would say that almost kind of mimics how the Midwest is like in temperament. I was actually talking to someone on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, the other day about this. Is people from the Midwest are very temperate in their spirit. They're very mild. They are sure they can fight and they've done amazing in the wars that America has fought in. But also, I mean, if you compare someone from Indiana, for example, or Ohio to someone who's in New York City, there's a difference. There's a difference in spirit. There's a difference in character, and I think that comes about because of their environment.
Well, it's
Yeah.
interesting you mentioned temperament as well, because that's kind of what we're talking about. And the Appalachian, I mean, I can attest to this myself. I mean, from my own family background, you know, my the entirety of my maternal side, my mother's side of the family, is all from Eastern Kentucky. So the Hazard area and the Manchester area and Southeast Kentucky. My grandfather came from a mining family. My grandmother came from a small farming family, sharecropping family in Eastern Kentucky, and the temperament of these people is, like you're saying, very much so built off of their environment, but they're also bringing that temperament over. So Mason mentioned the Scots Irish. The Scots Irish are sort of the picturesque frontiersmen, right? There are these fighters from southern Scotland, lowlands of Scotland, go over to Northern Ireland, and they whoop up on the Irish there, trying to be a buffer almost between the Gaelic Irish in Northern Ireland and the English establishment trying to wrangle in a new province in Northern Ireland. And they go in large parts, they go to America and perform that same role as being, they settle in Western Pennsylvania and into, West Virginia following the Great Wagon Road. And they serve very much so as a buffer between the English colonial establishment cities and towns and the, more eastern part of these colonies like Pennsylvania and Virginia. They serve as a buffer between that area and the Indians, who are and so they're kind of in no man's land. But that's the common understanding that we have of the Appalachian people, but which is in large parts it is true. I mean, and I've done quite a bit of genealogy, not only in my own family but also on families from Appalachia and people of the region. And although Scots Irish is a distinct and large amount of large ethnic group amongst the people, actually English is a more common ancestry, probably per most Appalachians are both Scots Irish and English, but they're more English than they are Scots Irish. Well, how does that make
With
sense?
some German as well
Right,
mixed in there.
as well, exactly, yeah. But we see, how does that fit in? Well, many of these families can actually these English families can trace their roots back to Jamestown or early settlement in the Virginia colony. And these people, and just if we can talk religion, these English people who were coming over either as indentured servants or as people working for something like the Virginia Company, as industrialists, they probably came over as Anglicans, as more high church, Anglicans, and established what is the Episcopalian Church in this country, which is essentially the Anglican Church of America, essentially. But as time grew on and more, and the colonies start to expand westward, more land opens up. More land opens up for these, middle class to poor English colonists, and they start to move west. But as they move west into these new uncharted lands, there are, meeting up, in conflict with Native Americans, but also with these, Scots Irish people coming down, and religion starts to change, and we get what is called the Great Awakening, right? So the first and second Great Awakenings happen, where if you're out in the wilderness and on the frontier and you're coming from an Anglican Episcopalian stock, but there's no Anglican priest around, there's no bishop around, there's no parish around, but you do get the circuit riders, so people coming around and preaching the gospel and preaching the Bible people. And some of these settlers, all they had was their Bible. So the religious sphere radically changes, what with people moving west, and we get kind of what we know today as these more low church American Protestant movements.
I think in such a big way that's contributed to the morality in those individuals as well. I listened to an interview. I don't know if it was your interview, Collin, with Joshua Abadoy, or if it was a different one that he had, but he talked about this intense moral tradition that people of Appalachia have that's not necessarily rooted in strong doctrine or in some intelligentsia, but it's just inherent, it's intrinsic to them. And I think a lot of that can be contributed to this storytelling culture, this oral passing down of these tales, the reading the King James Bible and not having necessarily the hierarchy that they had over in Ireland and Scotland and England. And you get them to come here, and you know it's pretty evident that as humans we are story driven individuals. We're not rational actors. uh, you can learn that in a lot of places, that our perception lies to us. We're not necessarily facts based or logical. We learn by stories and consequences and history and action. And I think that that is a big thing that the people of Appalachia have really passed down through that oral storytelling tradition. You can see that in their morality today as well.
Yeah, I think something that plays on that with the religion and with the temperament is if you look at, for example, the English, as you were talking about, Sam, there's the barrier between the old colonies, so to speak, and what would be the Midwest and the South. And you see predominantly wealthy English settling those colonies in the fact of look at the early families in Virginia, Pennsylvania, etc., Massachusetts, obviously, Rhode Island, etc. Um, all those places were settled by these very wealthy, often Puritan English. And because of that, you see much more typically liberal theology than you would in the South, where, and this is something we can get into, but typically when there's a lack of hardship, theology can tend to change. And so this is something we've talked about, Sam, is for example, in Russia, where there was a great deal of relative suffering and poverty, you see much more asceticism than you would, for example, in New England in the United States.
Yeah, that's a great point. And just, it's funny, Mason brought up three elements of sort of Appalachian um, religiosity and sort of cultural framework that I can attest to from hearing stories from my own mom talking about her family. So, Mason mentioned King James Bible. Well, there are certain people in this, I think this would come in large parts from this Appalachian sort of religiosity of where the King James Bible is the only Bible you should read. It's the only one. It's the best one. It's the best translation. All others are inferior. King James or nothing. That's how my grandfather was. That's what my mom always says. That's what my grandpa would say. And he was born in Blue Diamond, Kentucky. A coal mining town. Mason also, and Mason also mentioned, sort of, they didn't have an established sort of hierarchy. It was just kind of them and their own inherent, you know, religious understandings. Well, my great grandmother, worked a farm for a large part of her life by herself, in Laurel County, Kentucky, and she read the Bible cover to cover. And kind of the only church she kind of went to was revival meetings that they would have, about 45 minutes, an hour away or so from where she lived. Revival meetings. If any of the listeners or anybody has seen "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou," you see the scene, where they're doing baptisms and they're having that's very much so what it was like, at that time. And yeah, so I think that's really important. And this is why I think song and our Christian faith works so well together. Music, we talk about the true, the good, and the beautiful theologically. Well, you can't know really the true and the good without the beautiful, right? And vice versa. Yeah. So, liturgical music is key for us Christians, but even in these lower church, understandings of Christianity, music is still very, very important to the faith. So, and we get songs like, "I'll Fly Away" or "Where Fang Stranger" or "Can't Feel at Home Anymore" from, the Carter family or whoever, or the Stanley Brothers. And those songs are, we get a whole genre of music from, our people here. This is gospel music, right? Yeah. Everybody knows gospel music when they hear it, and that's, of course, very influential in the history of country music. But those titles, like "I'll Fly Away" and "Where Fang Stranger," those speak to a sort of death to this world, if we can use that terminology, right? Yeah. They see that there's something better than this world, and that they know that they're sojourners. We're pilgrims, and they get that. And the Appalachian people, through, we're, as a culture, as a people, we know hardship. We know hardship well, and we know it really well. And our religion, our religiosity, and our songs speak to that, and they speak to our eternal home.
Yeah. The environment is seeming to be a continuing role in this conversation, in the fact of, suffering ruralness in the United States to this very day. Obviously, there's a massive divide between city dwellers, suburban people, and the rural folk. You anyone who's in the Midwest or South or even the West, I mean, you can see no starker contrast than Las Vegas and then go to rural Nevada. Like, there's no starker contrast than that. Or, for example, as we're all in Indiana right now, Indianapolis is a massive city relative to many places in the world, 800,000 people roughly. Compare that to what you see in southern Indiana, where you're from, Mason, and yeah, it's as clear as day
Boonville, baby.
because they're different people, different ancestry in a sense of you know, the temperament. It all goes back to the temperament of what religion people have, what culture they have, and the environment that shapes that. And obviously, there's the whole argument of, does culture shape environment or does environment shape culture? I'm a big believer in that, both, really. That people take what they have from back home, so to speak, from the old world. We see that with country music, and they move it into the new world with the storytelling, as you're talking about. And obviously, country music and folk music is one of the biggest exports that the American South and Appalachia have. That's the culture.
And it comes straight from England, Scotland, and Ireland. You can trace the melodies
Exactly.
right back.
Yeah.
And this it's sort of this indomitable sort of like fighting spirit the Appalachian people have, which they got from their ancestors, but they perfected in a way. And it's like every major war the United States has fought in, Appalachians have been overrepresented.
Definitely.
From the American Revolution to the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now you could say that's part of the environment. They need to get out. Like my grandfather didn't want to go to the coal mine, so he joined the Marine Corps. But I think it's also just part of the value system of the people. So yeah.
Yeah. You want to contribute to that, Mason?
Yeah, you talked about where you can trace back some of this music to. I think it's so interesting. Some people that kind of get forgotten sometimes when you think of everybody that are kind of going into this conglomeration in Appalachia. You not only have the Germans, English, Scots, Irish. You also have the Native Americans in the region,
Hmm.
which they ended up learning a lot from and contributed a lot to their culture moving forward. And then also African Americans that they took with them.
Hmm.
And you can see that in the music as well. So you get like this yodeling from Scandinavia and Germany and like this bluegrass music. And then you get some of the melodies and the hymns from Old English, but then you also get this soulful vibe that like the Africans kind of brought over. So I think that's pretty awesome to see as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The African instrument. Yeah.
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 Yes.
And that's really the melting pot of America. And you see that no more any other place than Appalachia because of the environment. I mean, people often say that Appalachia, and rightly so, it's the poorest area of the country. But also, all of our culture that we look up to as Americans, when we look to the past, when we look to traditionalism, what we want for America, it all comes from there. Everything that we want and what we want to restore is what Appalachia once was. Now, we're not talking about, going down in the coal mines and that whole mentality in life and the suffering that people went through, but rather the values, the principles. Um, and really, I think what a lot of it boils down to as well is family. Family is so much more important in Appalachia than it is in the Northeast. And I would argue even more than the Midwest as well, where even in the Midwest, family is very important, but no more so than in the South and Appalachia.
It's very interesting because you can think about Appalachia as being this we talked about, and I said sort of rugged individualism, but it's really also simultaneously a very clannish society. So clan values, intermediate or closely connected family and kin groups. That's very very important to the social fabric. Kind of what holds the people together and the society together. And we talk about, so politically, it's a very interesting region because historically, um, Appalachia post Civil War voted very much so Democrat. While now, and I'm not exactly sure when it started. I'm guessing in the later part of the 20th century. It's been staunchly Republican, red. But I mean, we can trace this back, at least the Democrat voting, to the Civil War. So Appalachia was, a battleground between Confederate sympathizers and Union sympathizers.
Yeah.
You would have counties being split, and
Brother versus brother.
brother versus brother. Yes, exactly. And like a county over, most of those people are Confederate. This county is mostly Union, and these are not where the great large battles of the war. There's no Gettysburg here, but it's backwoods fighting between neighbors essentially, which is even more barbarous and ugly. But very much so, where you fought during the Civil War determined how you were going to vote going forward. So like speaking like that, then there's been always this distrust of centralized authority in Appalachia. We can trade, one of the most famous, parts of Appalachian history is the Battle of Kings Mountain. So these, frontiersmen, over mountain men from Virginia and Tennessee and North Carolina, were threatened by a British officer, Major Patrick Ferguson, his loyalist militia. They were threatened by them that if they didn't lay down their arms and basically submit to the British government, they would, burn their towns and villages and, destroy them. And if you people of our temperament in Appalachia, you tell us you're going to destroy us, well, there's going to be a fight. so the over mountain men, the frontiersmen, gathered up, got together in their militias, and they went and they ambushed this British officer and his troops, and this became the Battle of Kings Mountain. It was a great victory and a turning tide for the Patriots, for the frontiersmen. It was a great turning of the tide of the American Revolution. That's kind of what happens. In that same spirit that fought at Kings Mountain was the same spirit that was inside the coal miners who rioted against the corporations in West Virginia.
Harlan.
And Harlan, yeah. I mean, these are the largest uprisings America had seen at that point, and thousands and thousands of bullets were fired by these miners versus they had to bring the United States Army in to quell it. People don't really talk about that, but it happened.
Yeah.
So
you guys both brought up really good points there, and a lot of it centers around how we're looking to the Appalachian people for the American identity. So it's like all of us are just looking to the southeastern middle part of our country for this American identity. And I think part of that is because of the ecosystem, the geography that they're set in, they're kind of conservative by force and traditionalist by force because they're held back from some of the other innovation that has been brought in. It's not traditional city building. They haven't got a lot of the funding, all sorts of those things. So it's like looking back into the past and seeing what America used to be like 35, 40 years ago, a lot of times when you look into rural Appalachia, just because they haven't had the time or the resources to catch back up. And I think that's super interesting. And you talking about how, they don't like to really be told what to do. They don't like a tyrant. And, it had been a while since you had seen this sort of vibe come out of Appalachia since like those riots you're talking about. And then last year, I believe it was last year. I mean, we're in one of the most politically divided, tumultuous times of our entire nation's history. And what did it take? It took some dude out in West Virginia to go out and record himself playing on the banjo, Oliver Anthony. And everybody everywhere heard this song within 24 hours. And you really get this bringing together, and it's like, oh, that's what the American spirit really thinks. And you get this storytelling culture, and it's like, okay, I know that this was divided, us up here in the Midwest, but I don't really know how to articulate it. And then you just get some 6'4" ginger dude from West Virginia to go out there and put it into an epic song. And it's like, that's what we were thinking.
Yeah. A lot of people can't, it's not like something you can just write down and say, this is the spirit of Appalachia. This is the ethos, We're trying to describe it the best we can, but the thing that best describes it is song. Yeah. And that's why I feel like the song is so important. Why country music? I mean, look at country music today. You have Morgan Wallen and Luke Bryan and the rest, and
Oh,
Luke Combs,
mention
and
some good
they're
ones in there.
what?
Mention some good ones in there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Benjamin Todd from Lost Dog Street Band would be one of those.
Okay.
If you haven't checked him out, check him out. He's as authentic Appalachian as it gets from Kentucky. But I've had the chance to meet him, and he's quite the man.
Awesome.
But basically, what you see with these type of people is the rebellious spirit, which is so deep ingrained into them. It's not rebellion in the sense of every single authority. They're not going out and saying, we want to defund the police or we want to get rid of the police or something like that. It's they respect the police. They respect authority, but it's the sense of I'm going to do what I want to do. I'm going to live my life and I'm going to do it the best way I know how because I want to do what's best for my family.
Yeah. That
And I feel
follows
like
those
that has a
intrinsic
lot of
values.
the intrinsic values. I feel like that has a lot of the nature from the old world of the clans.
Yes.
That's something you would talk about, Sam, is the clans of taking care of the kin, taking care of your family, taking care of the people in your holler.
Exactly. It's clan loyalty, and there's a lot of good in that, but there's also the more negative competitive sides of that because what also is, of course, very famous in Appalachia, especially Eastern Kentucky, is the clan feuds. So we hear about the Hatfield McCoys, but it wasn't just the Hatfield McCoys. They call Breathitt County, which is right next door to Perry County, where my grandfather's from. They call that Bloody Breathitt, right? Because that there was so many different family rivalries, the Strongs and the Turners and the Howards and Bakers and in Clay County, and they were just going at it, and that's why I think in very historically speaking, I think you can argue that it's really true that the sentiment that the American public got about Appalachia, the sort of stereotype that we have in our minds about the hillbilly, they got that because the New York Times, or the Washington Post were writing articles about look at these crazy Appalachians killing each other, right? And then you got in these these family feuds, and it wouldn't be like they're just families. Is that the Hatfields, the governor of West Virginia is a Hatfield, the mayor of whatever town is a McCoy or whatever. It's like intimately linked politically in the region as well, and that's kind of where that stereotype comes from. And
Yeah, but also you see it in film as well, though.
absolutely, yeah,
Film continued to develop that over time.
right,
The southern redneck hillbilly that people look down upon just because of their accent.
right, and in some sense, and for us, like we'll come by it honest, like yeah, we do dumb, we've done dumb stuff. Like part of our problems are our own problem, or we've caused them, but at the same time, part of our problems have been caused by outside forces as well. So it goes both ways, but the only way to actually help the region recover and develop into like the beauty which it actually has within it is to own up to these things and to take responsibility for them and to not sit back on any laurels and to work through it, and that and that can only happen through taking responsibility as far as that can go, right? I mean, there has to be external help as well, but that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah. So I think that kind of leads us into the conversation of religion, because religion obviously has a massive influence on the Appalachian people, from the Baptists to the Presbyterians to the Methodists to the Pentecostals in later times, and then up to your modern, Southern Baptist, non-denom churches. The Appalachian people are by far the most quote-unquote churched people in the United States, by far. Obviously, in the United States early on, you would have seen that in Virginia and the Northeast with the similar denominations, Presbyterians, Methodists, etc. But then you'd also see those more liberal theological groups come out of the Unitarians and more liberal Methodists and Presbyterians. And you see the likes of Emerson come about, for example, and many other similar figures, as well as like Thoreau. Now, don't get me wrong, I absolutely love the work of Thoreau, but it's a different temperament than what you would see in the South of, steadfastness, caring for tradition, and caring for what the ancestors have passed down from the Reformation. In the North, it's much more theoretical, intellectual, and really focusing on, what can we develop? What can we innovate on? they didn't have a sense of tradition as deeply perhaps as the South did of, we must conserve what we have, if that makes sense.
Just from personal experience, my mother came, of course, coming from this Appalachian background, came from a Protestant background. Variety of denominations in her family tree. I mean, I'm descended from Baptist ministers and Methodist ministers and so and the like. But she converted to Catholicism when I was in high school. And the two things that stick out to me, if I can think of my own family and my mom and what that reflects in the Appalachian ethos, two things that stick out to me is a fierce devotion to the scriptures and a very real and powerful relationship with the person of Jesus Christ. Those two things. So a sort of scriptura and Christocentrism. Now, those are all great. I mean, those two things are great. I mean, of course, the scriptures are the oracles of God, and Jesus Christ is the God-man, right? He's our Lord. But the trouble that can happen when there is no central authority, there is no hierarchy, there is no focus on doctrine, is that if it's just you and your Bible out in the wilderness, in the frontier, with the circuit riders, you shouldn't be surprised if, give that time to settle, give that 100 years of that kind of environment, and you're going to get thousands of different little churches who are preaching different things. And you're going to get people who come away with wild interpretations of something they read in St. Paul, and the next thing you know, you got guys handling rattlesnakes.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. The snake wranglers.
And that's not something that's we just say that or theoretical. Or that happened in Harlan County, Kentucky, where my family's from.
Yeah.
I mean, that was very, very common. Snake handling.
Might as well.
So then that was common amongst Pentecostals. And you see this too, is like what we talked about initially with the the colonial Protestantism and colonial religion, is especially up north but also into the South. Probably not so much coming from the Anglicans, but from other Protestant groups like the Baptists and so on. You get a more Calvinistic understanding of kind of fire and brimstone. My mom would talk about one of her grandmothers very much so came from a sort of fire and brimstone understanding of theology. Kind of a sort of harshness and a sort what we kind of characterize as harsh Calvinism. But again, with that Great Awakening, is then you get the sort of preaching of John Wesley or the Wesley brothers and other Protestant thinkers that form the Methodist denomination, and you get a much deeper focus on a loving God, and on essentially the Methodists talking about theosis, talking about divinization, and that sort of so those two kind of elements, the more harsher Calvinism, more reformed, with the newer Methodist, bringing about, which comes out of the Church of England, kind of melting together in Appalachia. You kind of get a hodgepodge of, theology, which kind of can, of course, lend to all these different local churches and so on. So,
yeah. Do you want to add to that, Mason?
I mean, coming from a Protestant background, obviously we're all three coming from kind of different Christian backgrounds here. I have no things that Sam said that really points out as like false or aren't necessarily negative implications of a lack of hierarchy, and are obvious implications of kind of being on your own with the scriptures. There is an inherent beauty to that, and encountering Christ out in the field by yourself, or in the hymnals, in the little barn on the hill that you have. But I actually have family from eastern Tennessee in the Gatlinburg-Sevierville area. That's where my mom's whole side of the family comes from. But it's interesting that within this rich religious Protestant just culture, I don't believe, and I don't want to offend any of my family here, but I think that for the most part, a lot of them are not religious at all. So I don't really have a good firsthand knowledge. My mom didn't become a Christian until actually meeting my dad and her family coming up here. So I don't know. I don't necessarily have that same firsthand knowledge of you guys, even though I do have some family that comes from those parts and still live there.
Yeah. There's also different areas though within Appalachia, obviously. And then you have bordering areas as well. For example, to the east, you would have the coastal, the tidewater areas, Carolina. Carolina is its completely different culture in a sense. It has the southern culture, but it also has, Charleston, for example, is its own unique subculture within Tidewater, within Carolina. And that has a more, high church Anglican, more Catholic, um, more reverential theological background than you see, for example, in the backwoods of Kentucky. And that directly plays into what we're talking about with the environment, because the whole environment can change also the religion. For example, you're not going to see a hard shell Southern Baptist in New York City as high a chance as you would in, somewhere in Kentucky or somewhere in southern Indiana or the like, just because the environment in which they do their theology, the environment in which they live and they want to live, is unique to them. It's kind of like their natural habitat, you could say, of Catholics generally live in more urban areas. Don't get me wrong, there's many rural Catholics, and they do extremely well in the South and Appalachia. But the Protestantism, as you're talking about, Mason, the rugged individualism, going out on the frontier, those places are very natural for Protestantism to take hold. And Sam, as both of us are of the Orthodox persuasion, you also see Orthodoxy now taking more hold in those areas because of the ruralness, the ruggedness, and the asceticism that Orthodoxy teaches, which obviously comes from the villages of Greece and the Siberia and Russia in general, the villages out there. So if you want to add to that, Sam.
Yeah, so you have, now we have Holy Cross Monastery, so real core, uh, Russian Orthodox Church Abroad Monastery in Wayne County, West Virginia, which is
Yeah.
the heart of Appalachia. And I think really much so the Orthodox sort of Sobornost understanding of Catholicity and sort of the perfect middle ground between not being too decentralized, not being too overly centralized, really finds a kindred spirit in the Appalachian people, and especially with this sort of asceticism. So I think really what you see in if you know in a potentially Orthodox expression or a Appalachian expression of orthodoxies, you can see sort of the inner asceticism that is natural to the Appalachian man being fully
Mhm.
expressed theologically and doctrinally in the Orthodox faith. And I think really that's what the Appalachian people are missing, is that they have this great love for Christ. They have this loyalty to what they perceive to be truth, and they don't want to get away or depart from that perceived truth. It was very difficult for my mom to convert to Catholicism, because she felt like in a way she was betraying her ancestors when she was brought up in. But so those are great things, but they can be
Mhm.
further, lack of a better word, baptized or Christified or churchicized, whatever you want to call it, and given proper place. Because the biggest problem, this is another conversation, but to talk about the Protestant situation is that there's not a clear understanding of what the church is. So ecclesiology, and if you we talk about the church being one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. Well, what does it mean to be one, and what does it mean to be Catholic, or according to the whole universal in this sense? If you have all these different local churches who aren't in communion with each other, who preach different things, they all the only thing that unites them is the same scripture, but that's about where it ends because they have different interpretations of said scripture.
Yeah, that's why you have Pastor Jim says something, but Pastor John over there says something completely different. And so that also causes a bit of conflict and tension. You have historically looking, when you look through history, for example, of southern Indiana, you'll see some tension between like the Methodists and the Presbyterians and the Baptists. They all have their own little cliques.
Yeah.
They all have their own little subcultures of, well, that person's a Baptist, so we're not going to hang out with them, or that person's a Presbyterian, we're not going to hang out with them. And so people, even though they were all Protestant, they still had this divide that you're kind of talking about, Sam. They had this divide of splintering of, well, yeah, they're Christian, but they're not like us because, well, we don't know if they may not have the same Calvinist beliefs as us, or for
I think
example.
to a certain extent, it's definitely true with certain people, but at the same, so again, like Protestantism is not a monolith. Is that so? You can get Protestant
Yeah.
groups who are like that, but you can also get Protestant groups who, you know, the difference between a Baptist and a Presbyterian and a Methodist. Well, who cares? We're all Christians, you know. So
Yeah.
just because you get that or a non-denominational and evangelical, so like you can get maybe more starker rivalries between certain denominations, but at the same time, for many Protestants, it doesn't matter as much, you know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would be wary of. Yes, there is conflict sometimes, but I feel like in our culture today, we get on Twitter, we get on Instagram, and we go straight to the comments, and we see the fringe, the 1% of the 1% that has a problem, and like most people are not going out of their way on Twitter to start problems with other people. And I think that we look at social media and we get like a over evaluation of how much animosity there actually is between a certain amount of groups. From someone that has up in a primarily Protestant environment, it is much more the mere Christianity, love thy neighbor, hey, this person, we disagree on some things, but these are open-handed versus closed-handed. We're still sitting together at the dinner table type of vibe. And I know that they're and we can disagree on this, probably not like the place for it, and like we could go back and forth, but there's still this this familial love between all of them, even though there are these doctrinal differences. So yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
I definitely agree with that. But I guess I was speaking more historically. If you look at late 1800s, early 1900s, you know, if you read some memoirs, some accounts from individuals, you know, they would say, well, we grew up being Lutherans. And so, you know, but Susie across the street, well, she was a Catholic, or John on the other street, you know, he was a Methodist.
Yeah.
And so you, obviously, I use the word Catholic there for Roman Catholics, but also, you know, today things are much more unified because there's less Christians, I would say. It's more unified because, you know, due to there being fewer professing Christians, and what I mean by that is not people who call themselves Christians, who go to church on Christmas and Easter and such, but actually people who are attending church, you know, who actually are committed to the faith. There's much more unity amongst people in the fact of, you know, our common goal of, traditionally speaking, if you're a member of church, or term traditional Christianity, you have traditional Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox theology. You know, we all have the same goal in mind of what we want. We want to, especially in America, we want our family, we want our home, we want happiness to the greatest degree possible. We want our kids to have a better future. We want to be able to defend our family, and we want our nation to do well. Those are some of the common principles and common tenets that we all believe in. And I think that may be something more politically than theologically, obviously, is Christians tend to be more of a voting bloc. You know, obviously people talk about how the evangelicals and how they are a big voting bloc, but I'd say Christians as a whole are a big voting bloc because there's some very non-negotiable things that we would all believe in for the traditional side of Christianity.
And, you know, Mason mentioned, you know, sort of close-hand, open-hand issues. That's almost echoing exactly what my mom would talk about. You know, are these rib issues or these spinal issues? And very much so, that is the feeling, and that is the sort of understanding amongst, I would say, probably the bulk of American Protestants today, is that, you know, most of the understanding amongst most Protestants that most of our problems or most of our differences are really rib issues. They're not spinal. They're not, you know, deathly. And I would also agree with you, Collin, about, you know, really what's uniting Christians today, whether you're Catholic, whether you're Orthodox, whether you're Protestant, is that Christianity in general, sort of by what I mean by Christianity is everything that all three of those groups would agree on. So just a lot, you know, all the things that it would entail, are under attack today. They're under attack from outside the church, but even worse, they're under attack from within the church. So you can go through, you can find Protestant, you know, hierarchs. I know you don't have a technical hierarchy, but like your Protestant hierarchs, you can find Orthodox hierarchs, and you can find Roman Catholic hierarchs who, you know, theologically speaking, are a problem, right? Problematic, and that's hard for the faithful, you know. So so again, like that is what is uniting us. But at the same time, you know, just because that is what is uniting us, that's good, and we can come together on that. We should also, you know, like Mason and I have talked about before, you know, it's a problem that Mason and I don't go to the same church on Sunday and receive the same body and blood of our Savior on Sunday. That's a problem, right? And that's something that you know, through prayer and through coming together in brotherly love can be, you know, ought to be worked out, right? So, you know, Mason and I are
Bible study. Yeah.
Every Bible study, Mason and I are in a Bible study together. We end every Bible study with prayer intentions, and one of the prayer intentions we pray for is Christian unity. So pray for Christian unity, so unity in truth. That's you know,
that's something big for PR, obviously, that we fully believe in, is not just unity of Christians, but unity of people who believe in traditionalism. You know, that's one of the main tenets behind Philosophical Rambler is traditionalism, and what we want to put out there for, I mean, Christians make up the vast majority of traditionalists, because it's what our mainly our heritage is made of, and the culture that came about through that. So when we make this content, when we talk about traditionalism, what we're trying to do is to unify people, because whether someone is Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, or they're not Christian at all, they can still embrace that Christian heritage. We have people within Philosophical Rambler who are not Christian at all, but who embrace traditionalism and would believe in the same principles that Christians do, even if they don't hold to the faith, because they see the societal benefits of those beliefs and the practices that have been held for centuries, if not millennia.
Christianity is so steeped into the Western fabric is that it's become like camouflaged. Like people don't even realize they live in a Christian culture. We're that Christian, you know? Like Western civilization is that Christian that it's no longer people think, oh, it's distinctly Christian. But like even if you're a non-believer, the values you've inherited, the social grammar you've inherited from a Christendom.
Yeah. And as we see as a society, this camouflage maybe is starting to wear off and it's starting to become more apparent. You get atheists coming out that have been traditionally speaking very negatively against the impacts of the Christian religion. But now they're coming out and it's like, whoa. You know, maybe I don't agree with it, but I like Christmas and I like the fact that people go to jail when they kill somebody, and I like the things that come with a Christian environment and a Christian ethos within the country, even though I don't believe in it. And there's pros and negatives to that. You know, I don't want people to necessarily go be good people, you know, hot or cold. Don't be lukewarm. I want people to know Christ, because, you know, if the devil can get you to be a good person and not want Christ, then he's going to do that. But there are some big social, environmental, and just good benefits all around to having and living in a virtuous society and reaping the fruit that can be planted from that. So, you know, there's pros and cons, but we do see that change in atheists as we see it become more and more apparent that, hey, maybe some of this is wearing off. They're like, maybe we don't want this to go away. You know?
Yeah.
Dawkins, you know, recently said the exact thing essentially, and you know, it's like, you know, you mentioned Christmas, Easter, right? Like Christmas and Easter, people don't even realize what we're really celebrating on Christmas and Easter. Not to mention, people don't realize that the only reason we're celebrating those is because they're part of the liturgical calendar of the Christian church. Yeah. Right? They're celebrations, they're major feast days in the life of the church. You know, and that's why we celebrate it. That's where it comes from. And people don't even realize that. That's what I mean by Christianity being so steeped into our Western civilization. So when people who are non-believers, you know, essentially talk bad about Christianity or whatever, they're essentially blaspheming the king and his kingdom. They're living in the king's kingdom, blaspheming the king. I mean, that's essentially what's happening. So it's just ironic. You know, it's ironic.
In the case of Dawkins, it's very interesting too, because this is a guy that you had wrote a book like 15 years ago, and basically made the case that, hey, God doesn't exist, but if he does, and this is kind of the Ivan Karamazov argument, if he does, he's a moral monster, right? And you get this guy,
Mhm.
I think he has a quote that's saying like the Old Testament God is the most immoral being that humans could ever create, blah blah blah. But then flash forward 15 years later, and you can now see the implications that this Old Testament and New Testament God had on society as a whole, and maybe reality is causing some people to eat their words a little bit, which is always nice to see.
Yeah, I mean, this is an analogy I've used in the past. I believe I've used it on the podcast, perhaps, is put an atheist who says that there's relative morality in a line at the grocery store and cut in front of them. They're going to say, hey, that's not fair. Well, how is it not fair if there's relative morality? It's totally fair. You can cut in front of me, I can cut in front of you again. They're going to say, well, that's not fair. Well, obviously there's morality and there's right and wrong right away.
Either that or you become
So
a
that's the
tyrant.
problem.
Yeah, you can't. There can be no uh, subjective morality and you ever disagree with somebody. So, like, if I think something's right and you think something is right, but I hold that there's subjective morality, that you make your own good and evil, the moment that I try to argue with you about what is good and evil, I become a tyrant. I become a person that forces my subjective beliefs that I already claimed. There's this cognitive dissonance. I've already claimed that you don't have to hold true to this because everything is subjective. But now I'm saying that this is right or wrong. So Hitler. I mean, that's the classic argument. You become a tyrant if you try to say that Hitler is wrong and you believe in subjective morality. So
I mean,
Yeah.
the whatever you want to call the opposite of what we're doing. We're traditionalists. The opposite of that, whatever you want to call it, liberalism, wokeism, progressivism. Their emblem, they're all kind of, they're all kind of, in the same sphere. Their emblem should be the Ouroboros, which is a snake that eats its own tail, because they inevitably
Mhm.
devour themselves. They can say whatever they want to say, but when it comes to justification, they really have none. And eventually
Yeah.
they'll eat.
To add to that point,
Eventually, they'll eat their
yeah,
own. They'll eat their own, as we saw in the French Revolution when they started guillotining
that's what I was gonna
Maximin
say.
and Robespierre, and we see it today when
Yeah.
they get
Viper.
after.
It's the eternal revolution that goes on and on. Because you look at the revolution in France, French people are very revolutionary, which we didn't know that for about 1,000 years, obviously. But the when you see the French Revolution in the late 1700s, that completely changed the paradigm of the world. You didn't see revolutions before that point, obviously. I mean, obviously you saw revolts and you saw rebellions and such, but it wasn't an ideological based revolution like you saw at that time. And once you had that happen, rebellion became something that existed. It's like people didn't, it wasn't materialized in the world, if that makes sense. Rebellion was not materialized in the minds of people to the degree that it was after the French Revolution. So after that time, though, very quickly thereafter, you see the American Revolution, and tying it back to what we're talking about today, the Appalachians, that became directly influenced and ingrained into them. And though they are not a continually revolutionary people, that is the inherent distrust of authority that you both have been talking about. And the fact of, we want to protect what we have and we're going to be frugal, we're going to keep our culture, and we don't want anyone touching what we have pretty much. And people look down on them because of that.
I
Yeah.
must say, I'm impressed with your ability to weave our off conversation back into that. That was very well done, Colin.
Thank you.
We're starting to talk about what we really love, so we're getting a little trap. But yeah, I mean, you see that with the Appalachians is that this, this sort of religious spirit that we're talking about, it comes with them, and it comes from their Protestant past of a real strong distrust and seeing as suspect real strong centralization. And of course, for the Protestant reformers, that was the Roman See, and of course, for the revolutionaries in America, that was the British monarchy, and the same thing for the French revolutionaries, that was the Ancient Regime, right? So
Yeah. To kind of move us into the last point of our podcast today, what we see a lot of, and I talked to Joshua Abadoy about this in the recent interview that I did with him on PR, is the gentrification that's really happening in parts of Appalachia. For example, Nashville, Tennessee has become a massive center of growth. And Mason, I know that you went there recently and you can attest to that. It's a booming area economically with a lot of tourists, a lot of new residents, and you kind of see that sprawl starting to happen that you saw in the Midwest. You start seeing suburbs start being built and it keeps going further and further out. I'm curious to hear what both of you think if Appalachia will continue to have this sprawl that continues to go further and further out, if more people continue to move there, what the consequences will be, I guess. We'll start with you, Sam.
Well, sort of kind of like before I answer that, I'll kind of reverse it.
Sure.
Again, like, I keep going back to my own family because it's kind of like the center nucleus point for my sort of knowledge of Appalachia, my interest in the region and the history of the people. But really what you got in the 20th century largely was essentially a mass exodus from Appalachia into Midwestern, industrial towns. So, my parents are from Hamilton, Ohio, which is in southern Ohio, and my mom's side came to Hamilton, Ohio, from Eastern Kentucky, of course. And Hamilton, Ohio, to this day, it is developing, but the bedrock of Hamiltonian culture, of Hamiltonian society, the people are in large parts descendants of Eastern Kentucky Appalachian migrants. My mom was probably related to a large part of her high school. And those people came because they came from Eastern Kentucky. So these large clans, if you will, these families are coming up, en masse because they're looking for opportunity. They're going to go work in the factories. They're going to go work, in the general stores and whatnot, where they can find jobs because they're more, it's the best opportunity for their families. Now, with that being said, certainly it looks like, like you said, in places like Nashville, places like Knoxville, these areas are starting to boom, more people are starting to settle there, more people are starting to move there. And there's places in West Virginia, of course, like Wheeling and everything. But, when I think of Appalachia, I think of, the hollers of Southwest Virginia, West Virginia, East Kentucky, East Tennessee. And to my knowledge, those areas we can do better as a country in helping further develop those specific counties that I have in mind. Because, there's not really, large universities to speak of. There's not a whole lot of large industry there. Things move, industry very, very much so is moving out. So, of specifically the regions for like where my family comes from, there's a lot of, a lot more to be done in developing that area.
Yeah. There's a couple things that come to mind from you, from your little segment there, Sam. You talked about an exodus out of Appalachia there, and my family experienced a similar thing. Like my great grandpa came up here. Evansville is a pretty industrial area, got a job, went to the war, et cetera, et cetera. But also now in the 21st century, and maybe just recently in the past 5 or 6 years, especially since after COVID, we see the opposite happening, an exodus from these big cities that everybody fled into for better job opportunities. Now we're seeing them crave these intrinsic values that they know to be true, this cultural family values. They crave that. They want to go live in the holler. But the problem that we're seeing is, I think Waylon Jennings wrote a song about this a long time ago about Nashville. It's not what it used to be. You get, I know it's a joke now. You get, okay, everybody got tired of LA, so they moved to Austin and Nashville and made those new LAs. And I think a challenge that Appalachia has, specifically Eastern Appalachia, is how do we incentivize people to come in and economically develop this place and get a higher quality of life, cut down on the addiction, et cetera, but also not change the culture and the values that are crucial to the identity of that place. So I think that is a challenge because what are the guards that you put in place? And Joshua Abadoy is working on pushing money into this place, but also how do you dictate who moves in and who doesn't, and how do you do that without becoming authoritarian yourself? In business school, we're taught hire slow, fire fast to get the cancerous cells out of a corporate ecosystem. Well, it's kind of hard to do that when you're selling somebody something without it becoming like a commune and everybody has to think exactly the same way. So those are just some challenges that I see, but I think for the most part, things are looking pretty positive for Appalachian where things are headed.
Yeah. To give some thoughts to that as well, kind of summarize what you guys are talking about. This is something that Joshua Aberroy's talked about in the interview that we did, but also in other podcasts and such that he's been on, is figuring out, like you both have said, the challenge of inputting as much money as possible, as much wealth to develop those areas, but also retaining the culture. I think that's the crux of what we're trying to get to. And I have not seen it successfully be done, except for in one area, which would be Franklin, Tennessee, which is a suburb of Nashville. You see it being more of a small town that has now grown to being one of the wealthiest areas in the country, um, with home prices that are out the wazoo compared to how they used to be. As someone who visited many years ago and has watched it ever since, it has slowly grown more and more. But as someone, like I say, who's visited the place, it is it's retained, I should say, its small town feel. It's retained its culture and its people and its history because it has the Battle of Franklin, the American Civil War. There's a lot of historical monuments and buildings there. Um, I think that is kind of the blueprint for how things have to be done, is slowly and gradually developing things one by one. We can't just go in and start making suburbs in Appalachia. It simply doesn't work.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, there's the mountains, there's the environment. You can't just go in and start building in these hollers. It's not possible to build residential communities in most of these areas. And even then, if you did that, the negative effects that could come about, you start losing that culture. And then really, what does America have left? Because we're already on the cultural decline. And if we lose that, I mean, what else do we have?
Appalachia really is, in large parts, one of the most traditional areas in the country, remaining.
Yeah, for sure.
And that comes with its isolation, and of course, obviously, the reason there's coal mines in Appalachia is because there's coal in them hills, right? So I mean, these companies, these industries would come in and historically sapped the resources from the area and got out, left the.
Yeah,
That's why
get out.
that's why that West Virginia Cold War took place, right? So.
No.
But again, kind of circling back to where we began our conversation, it really is about environment. The environment really is crucial, and how exactly to mitigate that and kind of work around that, I don't really know right now.
Yeah.
But
I don't know anyone who's successfully formulated an answer to that.
Yeah.
And I mean, we see development to kind of conclude here. I'll let you guys have some final words in a second, but to kind of conclude my statement for the podcast would be, going forward for Appalachia, it's going to have to be slow development in those centers like you're talking about, Knoxville, Nashville. You're going to see those continue to grow. Obviously, your rent's going to go up. More restaurants are going to be added. More concert venues are going to be added. It's just going to be more of what they've already done. Kind of like what you would see in New York or LA. Those are going to become very different looking places than how they were 10 years ago, or even how they look today, looking 10 years into the future. But I think we're also going to see towns that say have 10,000 people now, maybe they have 20,000 people going into the future. They become more revitalized areas. This is something that actually Eric Dodden, who's running for governor currently in Indiana, as someone who's interested in Indiana politics, he has an idea to spend money, a surplus of Indiana state taxes, which Indiana currently has, to revitalize some of the small towns and the main streets that are in Indiana. And whatever you may think of that, that is an interesting plan that perhaps people in Appalachia could look into, of revitalizing those small towns, making them more touristy to a degree, having some attractions, but not touristy of Pigeon Forge, for example,
I can speak firsthand to a little bit of that Indiana state tax dollar development. So I come from a very small town in southern Indiana called Boonville, only about 6,000 people. And recently, over the last couple of years, we have got some state tax dollars to go in and fix up the square and some roads into town. But um, not surprisingly, you don't like the perception of all of this is not very positive, and for some good reasons. You know, people love our little small town of Boonville, which really I think that we're kind of a little brother of Appalachia in a sense. We hold on to a lot of those values. We got a little bit more hills than you guys up there, but so Boonville is actually its namesake is a guy by the name of Ratliff Boone. And there's
Hmm.
really two claims to fame that Boonville has, and there's not proof for either one of these claims to fame. So, number one, you come into our town, and on a sign it'll say where Lincoln learned the law. Because after Lincoln was born in Kentucky, about 6 or 7, he moved up to Indiana, lived there for his childhood, then went to Illinois. And he was around Warwick County, but we claim that he learned the law at our courthouse. But there's not a single historically accurate source to say that. And number two, we say that Ratliff Boone, the namesake of our town, was a cousin of Daniel Boone, which is a major player in Appalachia and Tennessee. So we're really
Yeah.
holding on to that, but there is no proof that Ratliff Boone is a cousin of Daniel Boone. But that just shows kind of this Midwestern vibe, the rest of the United States looking to Appalachia for some sense of identity and some desire to be affiliated with that real American spirit a little bit.
Yeah, Sam, if you want to give some final remarks.
And with regards to what to do, you know, with regards to the political situation and and kind of bringing industry and bringing the developing Appalachia. I don't have great answers. I don't really so I can't speak on that definitively. But perhaps what could be a suggestion. And I say that and perhaps take it with a grain of salt. But what could be a suggestion is and however you feel about him politically, I don't know a whole bunch about him politically. All I really know about him is this book and the movie. But J.D. Vance is a politician in Southern Ohio. He came from Middletown, Ohio, which is right by Hamilton, Ohio, where my family comes from. And he wrote a book called Hillbilly Elegy, sort of documenting his own personal story. His family comes from I think Breathitt County, but also the history of our region here, and sort of perhaps how to develop it and to help it. And I think more people like that trying to do things like that. Whatever you like I said, whatever you want to think about J.D. Vance politically, I don't really know, but you can't deny that he wrote a book that's popular and had a movie about it and that's popular, and that he's at least getting it out there. So I think one of the biggest problems for Appalachia is that we're forgotten. Appalachians are forgotten. The region's forgotten. It's kind of tucked away in those mountains, isolated like it's always been, and it's forgotten. Nobody, and I think the sentiment with the locals there is that if you were to ask them, oh, what do you think about the government? Like, what do you think about this? They'd probably say it feels like nobody cares. Like nobody really cares. That's kind of what it is. So at the very least, people getting out there, more Appalachians running for public office with the vested interest in helping out the area, I think it could be key.
Yeah,
Could be key for sure. So
Yeah. Get rid of those.
I think that's a good way. Yeah. Go ahead.
I
Mason.
said they need to get rid of those rich men north of Richmond, right, Sam?
yeah, get rid of Richmond, north of Richmond. Mm-hmm.
Oliver Anthony would agree with you.
Which politicians would stick up for my?
Yeah. It's to kind of wrap up everything here, guys. Super glad to have you on the podcast, and just some final remarks about what you both were saying is something that PR also always talks about, and something that we've interviewed several people about is localism. That's what you're kind of talking about there, Sam, is focusing on what we can do at a local level, what we can actually achieve on both like the city, the county, the municipal level, state level, all of those things. We have a great ability to change how our communities look and to change how they function and the culture going forward. As we say at PR, we are the culture. We are the people who can determine what is going forward in Appalachia. So I think that we definitely put out some good ideas today for people to think about. And yeah, glad to have you guys on today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for
Thanks
the
for having
opportunity.
us, Collin. Appreciate it.
Definitely.
Appreciate it, bro.
To all of our listeners or viewers, wherever you're listening or viewing the podcast, remember, if you're on Spotify, to give us a rating if you so like the podcast. It greatly helps our reach and to just encourage others to listen to these valuable ideas. And further, if you're on YouTube, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give us a like. And it greatly helps us to continue to do these podcasts and, like I said, reach more people with the ideas of traditionalism and the humanities. So thank you all for listening, and we will see you in the next episode of the podcast.